Okay, let's come back to section 140. We're in the third challenge by the Sadducees on the issue of the resurrection of the dead. And what Yeshua does in this case is to only quote one specific scripture. And what he quotes is Exodus chapter 3, verse 6, where God says, "I'm the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." What he does not do is quote the three classic passages that teach us resurrection, and these are Daniel chapter 12, verse 2, Daniel 12, verse 2, Isaiah 26, verse 19, Isaiah 26, 19, and Job 19, verses 25 and 26, Job 19, verses 25 and 26. These are three passages that clearly teach the resurrection of the dead, but he doesn't quote any of them to the Sadducees, and that for good reason, because another distinction between Pharisaic Judaism and Sadducean Judaism was this. Pharisaic Judaism believed that you could derive doctrine from any of the three divisions of the Hebrew Bible, be it the law, or the prophets, or the writings. But the Sadducees' view is that you cannot do that. Every doctrine must have its origin in the Torah. Every doctrine must have its origin in the 5 books of Moses. If it's found in the 5 books of Moses, then you can also use the prophets and the writings to illustrate that doctrine and give further information. But the origin must be in the Torah, and they couldn't find any promise of any resurrection anywhere in the 5 books, and therefore chose not to believe it. So to quote Isaiah or Job or Daniel, which would have been authoritative for the Pharisees, would not be authoritative for the Sadducees. So what he does is simply quote Exodus chapter 3, verse 6, "I am the God of Abraham, and the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob," which is the formula for the Abrahamic covenant. Now we've simplified that terminology today. We simply say Abrahamic covenant, but in Scripture is always a sentence. "I am the God of Abraham, and the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." And but the question now is, when the Abrahamic covenant did God promise a resurrection? And it's found in a very simple principle. If God makes a promise to an individual, but that individual dies before the promise is fulfilled, God is then obligated to raise that person back to life. And why? Number one, every promise of God must be fulfilled. But number two, it must be fulfilled to whom the promise was made. And God made a promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And whatever promises were made to specific individuals are to be kept to that individual. So by this point of time, in Abraham's day, God already made specific promises about Isaac. Promises unfulfilled at the time that Abraham was asked to sacrifice Isaac. So why was Abraham so willing to take his son to Mount Moriah and kill him in a form of sacrifice? Because by then Abraham's faith has matured to the point he knew if he had to kill Isaac, Isaac will be resurrected. Because again, every promise must be fulfilled to whom the promise was made. And so that's the point the writer of Hebrews makes in chapter 11. And he points out that Abraham knew that God raised him back to life. And how did he know it? Because the promise of God must be fulfilled to whom the promise was made. And so if he had to kill Isaac, Abraham had full faith that Isaac would be resurrected back to life. So contained in the unfulfilled promises to individuals found in any covenant like the Abrahamic covenant requires a concept of resurrection. And for example, to all three of the patriarchs, first to Abraham, twice he says, to you and to your seed I will give this land. Once to Isaac, to you and to your seed I will give this land. Once to Jacob, to you I will give this land. Yet all three men died, and how much of the land did they own? There was one burial cave they had to pay an inflated price for. Secondly, a plot of land near Shechem they had to pay good money for. And then thirdly, some wells that they had to fight for. So how is God going to keep his promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? Because they owned very little of the land when they died. Only way God can fulfill his promise is to resurrect them back to life. And so as we already saw back in Matthew 8, that in the kingdom, people will come from all over the world, from east and from west, and will sup or fellowship with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, because they'll be in the land and finally exercising ownership of the land as was promised to them in the Abrahamic covenant. And so again, as far as the issue of the resurrection, it must be fulfilled by virtue of unfulfilled promises. And the results of this discussion with the Pharisees is the people were astonished at his teaching. It was a new way of interpreting Exodus chapter 3, verse 6. And even the Pharisees were impressed. And so in Luke's account, verse 39, and certain of the scribes answering said, Teacher, you have well said. And they dared not any more to ask him any questions, meaning from the Sadducean perspective. And so the Sadducees were now silenced, but no more questions. Now section 141, the fourth attack by the Pharisees, also a question of theology, but this time the theology is, what is the greatest commandment? And that's in Matthew's account, verse 34 and 35, and the question was also to try him. And Yeshua's answer in the more detailed form is found in Mark's account, verse 29 and verse 30. The most important commandment of the Mosaic law is to love God with our whole being. And going beyond what they had asked for, the second most important commandment is you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And every commandment either conducts our relationship vertically with God or horizontally with fellow man. Therefore, this summarizes all that is in the law and the prophets. And the scribe who, as the teacher trying him, was impressed with the answer. So in verse 34 of Mark, and when Yeshua saw he answered discreetly, he said to him, you are not far from the kingdom of God. At this point, no man after that dared ask him any more questions. Now section 142. The challenge by the king. He now points a question to them. And the question is in Matthew verse 42, what think you of the Messiah? Whose son is he? They give the correct answer. He's the son of David. But then he has a follow-up question in verse 45 and 46 of Matthew. If the Messiah is the son of David, how come David calls his son Lord? A father does not refer to his son as Lord. In verse 46 of Matthew, no one was able to answer that question. And now the Pharisees are also silenced. Because as much as the Pharisees developed a theology of the Messiah, which was rather extensive, because it's not just what's found in Scripture, but also what's found in Pharisaic tradition. So, no matter how much they had developed, there was one element always missing. There was no concept of a messianic God-man. Though it's clearly so revealed in Scripture, the Hebrew Bible, they've always found a way around it. There was no God-man concept. And because there was no God-man concept, they could not answer the question. Because as to his humanity, he's the son of David, but as to his deity, he is the Lord of David. Now we have in section 143, I read the lengthy section dealing with the judgment by the king, and followed by even a larger section with the Olivet Discourse. We could divide what he says in section 143 in three parts. And the first part has to do what he says to the disciples about the Pharisees. And this discourse, this sermon, is his conclusion of his public ministry. Because after this, he will work only with the disciples until his arrest. So in the first division, Yeshua points out 5 things about the Pharisees. Number 1, the true nature of Pharisaism is hypocrisy. And that's the whole summary in verse 3 of Matthew. You will notice that Matthew provides the most details because Mark and Luke choose to report only which would be more relevant for their Gentile audiences. But a lot of what he says will be uniquely relevant for the Jewish audience, and therefore Matthew provides all of the details. Now, verse 2 of Matthew says, the scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat, and all things therefore whatsoever they bid you, these things do and observe, but do not after their works. What makes them so hypocritical, they say, but do not do. Now, some segments of our Messianic movement don't understand what the seat of Moses was. And what they often will teach is, this clearly shows that Yeshua told us to obey what the rabbis say. And therefore we must be obedient to them, except on the issue of what they say about Yeshua. And sadly, some of them followed the obedience of what they said about Yeshua and apostatized from the faith. Now, if you visit the remains of the synagogue in the city of Chorazin, and you go into the main door into the synagogue, immediately upon entry on the right-hand side, you will see this seat. Now, this seat is a copy of what they found. The original one is in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. And it may not be easy to read, but right here on the ledge it says the seat of Moses. They sit in the seat of Moses. It's a literal seat. And the purpose of the seat is to deal with civil cases. So there was a civil case between one person and another, one family or another. They will present the case to the one sitting at the seat of Moses, just like going before a civil case court in this country and presenting your cases to the judge. And whatever the judge determines, that is what has to be followed. The same thing was with the one sitting on the seat of Moses. So it's built on the Mosaic concept of the interpretation of the given law, which is the Mosaic law, and how this would be applied to specific civil situations. So he's not telling us all to obey everything the rabbis teach, and we saw how often he disobeys what the rabbis were teaching. So there's nothing to do with obeying the rabbis. And again, the whole focus is the oral hypocrisy. Often they say things for the people to do, but fail to do it themselves. Secondly, they're guilty of making the Mishnah a burden upon others while they find ways to get around it. That's in verse 4. And then he gives 2 examples. And he says, they bind heavy burdens and grievous to be borne, but they themselves will not move them with their finger. The examples he gives, for example, is in verse 5, they make broad their phylacteries. The phylacteries are small black boxes. One is worn on the forehead, one is worn on the right arm if you're left-handed, and left-handed if you're right-handed. Now this is in keeping with the Mosaic law of Deuteronomy chapter 6. He points out this made them exceptionally large, just to be seen by others. As since they do these things not to be obedient to the Torah, but to be seen by others, being seen by others is the only reward they will get. They also make enlarge their borders of their garments in verse 5. These are the tzitziot, these are the tassels. These are all tassels of white, there'd be just one tassel of blue. That's also in keeping with the Torah. This was something they ought to have done, but they made them unusually long just to be seen by others. So again, since the motivation was to be seen by others, being seen by others will be the only reward they will get. So verses 5 to 7, they are self-righteous and self-seeking. So they enjoy sitting at the chief seats in the synagogues. They enjoy receiving salutations in the marketplace. They love to be called rabbi or teacher or master or father. But these in verse, these were man-exalting titles. And they saw these men-exalting titles as because it would give them a certain position of honor. Now, if these were merely pupil-teacher relationship, it wouldn't be any difficulty. But the problem is that these were titles that gave the rabbi a certain amount of authority. So that in their teaching, the rabbi was supposed to be the most important person in your life. One example given by them is if your parental father and your rabbi were taken to captivity and offered for ransom, you first had to work to free the rabbi, and then you can work to free your father. But the rabbi must take priority in your life. But for the believers of the new body, they're not to seek these man-exalting titles, because in the body, we should be seen as co-equal and not to seek man-exalting titles. Now, in the Messianic movement, most leaders now chose to call themselves rabbis. I have no objections to this. I just wish they would get some training as a rabbi. Most of them can barely get through the Hebrew alphabet. And my question is, what is motivating them? Are they just seeking a title that gives them more elevation? That would be the wrong motivation. Very few of them has much rabbinic training as I've had over the years, but I refuse to use that title for myself. But other people in our ministry, it's not an area law, just my own personal preference. Others within our ministry do use the term rabbi. My advice to them is, well, at least get some basic training of a rabbi so you can know more about Jewish studies merely than that term. Now, the fifth point was a point not mentioned in Matthew. It's found in Mark's account. They're guilty of prostituting their religion. And that's in Mark verse 39 and 40. They love men exalting, they love to show off their spirituality, but they're guilty of covetousness, and by their covetousness prostitutes their religion. Because widows were to receive special protection under the Mosaic law. So rabbis, the Pharisees in particular, would never foreclose on the home of widow until they prayed about it first. But these prayers only hide their covetousness, and the covetousness is revealed on how they foreclose on homes of widows. Now the second division, using Matthew's account, which is the most detailed of the three, he now speaks directly to the Pharisees and pronounces 7 woes upon the Pharisees. And while these are for a variety of different sins, they form a circle in that the first woe and then the 7th woe will deal with the same sin. And the first woe is for rejecting his messianic claims and also leading the nation to reject him as well. The second woe, for turning proselytes into far worse legalists, and they went everywhere to convert people to Pharisaic form of Judaism. But in the end, these converts to Pharisaism became more legalistic than the Pharisees themselves were. Third woe, for switching priorities and giving priority to the consecrated, but not the consecrator. And he provides us with 2 examples. So in verse 16, if you swear by the temple, you don't have to keep your oath. But if you swear by the gold in the temple, you have to keep your oath. But what makes that gold special? As to its makeup, it's no different than gold anywhere else. What makes this gold special is where it was placed. In the holy temple is the temple that sanctifies the gold. The gold does not sanctify the temple. The second example is in verse 15. Excuse me, that should be 19. If you swear by the altar, you don't have to keep your oath. If you swear by the gift, the sacrifice on the altar, then you have to fulfill your oath. But what makes the body of the animal on that altar special? What makes it special is where it was placed on the holy altar. As to its makeup, it's no different than the same animal elsewhere in the world. It's the altar that consecrates the gift. The gift does not consecrate the altar. So by this form of way of taking note, in saying it one way you keep it, say it a different way you don't keep it, they're guilty of switching priorities, giving priority to the consecrated and not the consecrator. Now the fourth woe is in verse 23 and 24, for camping on the minor points of the law while ignoring the major points of the law. So he points out they're very careful to tithe of the smaller seeds. You tithe mint, anise, and cumin, and these were the smaller seeds known in first century Israel. And they're careful to tithe even the smaller seed, and he says this is what you ought to have done. This is part of the Torah. But the problem is they were leaving the more important matters of the Torah unfulfilled, undone. such as justice and mercy and faith. And for camping on the minor points of the law and ignoring the major points of the law. The fifth woe is for having far more concern for the external demands, ignoring the internal demands. That's the fifth woe. And he compares them to those who, after eating, wash the outside of the cup and the plate, leaving the inside dirty. From the inside they will eat again and drink again, and the old will corrupt the new. Sixthly, for their hypocrisy. Outwardly, they appear to be very religious, but inwardly, nothing changes. They're as corrupt as they were before. So he compares them with whited sepulchres. Even today in Israel, all outdoor sepulchres that are not part of a cemetery especially, they put in a fresh white coat of paint. The reason for this action is that those who are Cohens or priests and Levites cannot come in contact with a grave. So to make sure as they're walking, these could be easily seen, and they can walk around it. All of these given a fresh white coat of paint, so outward they look spick and span clean. But nothing changes on the inside. The inside is still full of corrupting, unclean, dead man's bones. Now the seventh woe is going to elaborate on the first woe. This generation will now be held accountable not only for rejecting his messiahship, but also for the blood of all the prophets of the Hebrew Bible. Now, by this point of time, everything the prophets were going to say about the Messiah had been said, and the Hebrew canon had been closed for about 4.5 centuries. They also had the ministry of John the Baptist, announcing the soon coming of the King in his own ministry, who he did not only do miracles others have done, but he did miracles that no one else has done before. Yet in spite of this, they found a reason to reject him. So now they'll be held accountable not only for rejecting his messiahship, they'll be held accountable for the blood of the Old Testament prophets. And notice he names two men in verse 35, Abel and Zechariah. Now, in the way the Jewish Bible is divided, the law, the prophets, and the writings, this refers to the first and the last. Now, the first one whose blood was shed was Abel. And Genesis is the first book, as it is in the English Bibles. The last book in the Jewish order is not Malachi, it's 2 Chronicles. And the Zechariah mentions here is killed in the last book of the Hebrew Bible, 2 Chronicles. And by naming these two men, he's saying you'll be held accountable for everything from Genesis to 2 Chronicles. This was a Jewish figure of speech, meaning the whole body of revealed written truth. Even we use a similar figure from Genesis to Revelation. That's our figure of speech for the whole body of revealed written truth. Now look at verse 36. Verily I say unto you, all these things shall come upon, and notice those two words again, this generation. This generation, guilty of the unpardonable sin, will now be held accountable for the whole body of revealed written truth. And then the third division, this is how he closes his public ministry, with the lament. And in verse 37, he laments over Jerusalem. And for 3 years now, he's been wanting to spread his hands out and give the city the protection of the messianic protection predicted by the prophets. But the verse says, ye would not. Literally in Greek, ye willed it not, when they rejected him. So secondly, behold, your house is left unto you desolate. The house is the temple. It will be desolate. It will be destroyed 40 years hence. But then notice his statement in verse 39 as he closes his message. For I say unto you, ye shall not see me henceforth till ye shall say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Now, from the Jewish frame of reference, as we mentioned in the triumphal entry, that is the official messianic greeting. When the rabbi came, when the Messiah came, he was to be welcomed with these words, Baruch haba b'shem Adonai, blessed is he that comes in the name of the Lord. And here he lays down the precondition to the second coming, in that just as the Jewish leaders years ago led the nation to reject him, a day will have to come when the Jewish leaders will lead the nation to accept him. That is the precondition to the second coming. He left the earth because of Israel's rejection. He will not come back to the earth until Israel accepts him. Now, once we clearly understand the precondition to the second coming, we'll see why Satan has had this long unending war against the Jews throughout Jewish history. Because Satan knows that Yeshua won't come back until the Jews ask him to come back, but he also knows there'll be no second coming until the Jewish people ask him to return. So if he could ever succeed in destroying the Jews before they have a chance to plead for Messiah's return, then he will not come back, and Satan's career will be safe forever. That's why he's always had this special war against the Jews from the time of Abraham. So that's why things like the Crusades occurred. That's why the Nazi Holocaust occurred. That's why the Russian pogroms occurred. And that's why Revelation chapter 12 states that once Satan is confined to the earth in the tribulation, once he's confined, he knows his time is short. 3.5 years before the second coming, and long as time is short, he expends all of his energies to try to wipe out the Jews once and for all. So here's the key distinction between the rapture of the church and the second coming for Israel. The second coming has a precondition. The second coming is part of God's program for Israel. And the precondition is the Jewish people must ask him to come back. But the rapture is part of God's program for the church. It has no preconditions. It could happen at any moment of time. It'll never be a datable event. It could happen any moment of time between right now and with the event that will trigger the tribulation, which will be the signing of the 7-year covenant. Now, once we understand the precondition to the second coming, we understand the theological foundations of anti-Semitism and why Satan has always had this unique war against the Jews. Satan knows that once Messiah returns, his career is over. He also knows he won't come back till the Jews ask him to come back. So if he can destroy the Jews before they have a chance of asking him to return, his career will be safe forever. But the second thing to notice is why he has used this one name more than any other name to persecute Jews. And since the 4th century, a good 95% of all wars against the Jews and mass killing of Jews were done in what I call in English the name of the 3 C's. The church, the cross, and Christ. The church, the cross, and Christ. Satan knows the name they have to call upon to bring him back, so his strategy over these centuries is to make that name odious in the Jewish community, has become very odious. But most Jewish people know nothing about the Messiah of the Scriptures. They're reacting to the Christ of church and Jewish history. And Jews have suffered more under so-called Christianity than ever under any other religion, including Islam. And that brings on the third point, that is a reason why we must both exercise, practice Jewish evangelism, but also support Jewish evangelism. Because part of Jewish evangelism requires us to make a distinction between the Christ of church history and the Messiah of the scriptures. Until the Jewish mind can separate that distinction, it'll be very difficult for the Jew to begin accepting this Yeshua as the Messiah. And that's been the reason for that strategy. Section 144, instruction at the treasury. He was now in Mark verse 41, sitting down over against the treasury section of the temple compound, and they were watching how wealthy people were putting all of these funds into the temple treasury. But then came a very poor widow, and all she could put in is 2 mites. And the 2 mites in Luke verse 2 was the legal minimum a person was allowed to put into the treasury. So he called his disciples in Mark verse 43 to call their attention to what was happening. And he points out, although she gave only 2 mites, she gave the legal minimum. In her heart, she gave a lot more than any of these wealthy classes did. Because in verse 4, look, these did of their superfluity, meaning it didn't hurt them financially for the amount they put in. But she of her want did cast in all the living that she had. So that was all the income she had at this moment. So now she would have to trust God to provide her to feed herself, her family. This provides a good example of what he was dealing with in this previous paragraph in his renunciation of the scribes and Pharisees, the difference between externalism and internalism. And the wealthy class were practicing externalism, but she was practicing internalism. And she walked away with the blessing of God, and God will fulfill the promise of taking care of such. So we come to the 8th main division of his life, the preparation for the death of the king, covering sections 145 through 164. And section 145, which is a lengthier section, is called the Olivet Discourse, called that because he gave this message when he was on the Mount of Olives. I gave you another subtitle that emphasizes more of the content, the prophecies of the king. You should be on the bottom of page 14. And I will not give you a verse-by-verse detail, but I will survey you the whole Sermon on the Mount. If you want the verse-by-verse detail, it's available in the manuscript here, called the Olivet Discourse, what the Messiah said about the last days. If you happen to have the book, The Footsteps of the Messiah, there is an appendix in the back that covers all this in detail. But we'll follow the 14-point outline, starting on page 14. First of all, the historical setting. Now he was leaving the temple compound for the last time. And as they were leaving the compound, the disciples pointed out to him how these magnificent buildings of the temple compound was adorned with goodly stones and offerings in Luke verse 5. They're especially impressed with the stones in Mark verse 1. What manner of stones, what manner of buildings. Now these were the largest stones ever used in building construction up to that point of Israel's history. And most of them measure between 12 to 14 meters long, but some are very much larger, weighing literally tons. It's still somewhat of a debate how they're able to get these huge masses of stone to go on top of each other. Even at this point, it was still largely being built because Herod the Great began the rebuilding of the temple compound in the year 20 BC. The building of the temple was done very quickly because of the importance of it, but the other buildings of the compound would take many more years. It wasn't finished till AD 64, only 6 years before everything was destroyed. In Yeshua's response, looking at Matthew, end of verse 2, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. He's not talking about the compound wall. People often ask me, well, isn't the Wailing Wall still one rock upon a stone upon another? He's dealing with the buildings of the temple, not the stone wall around the temple. And indeed, there's no single stone on top of another of what used to be the temple building. And how this prophecy is fulfilled is that in next to last stage of the conquest by the Romans, according to Josephus, Titus warned his soldiers, told his soldiers not to destroy the temple because of the magnificence of the building. But in the heat of the fighting, a Roman soldier took a torch and threw it inside the first room. Now, while the walls were made of these huge stones, it was overlaid with gold. So and covering the gold were material coverings, and the material coverings began to catch fire and began to melt the gold. The gold began seeping in between the crevices. And so when things cooled down to get to the gold, the Roman soldiers removed one stone from top of another. Now this prophecy leads to specific questions on the part of the apostles. To now cross over the Kidron, they have climbed the Mount of Olives. And notice in Luke verse 1, and as he sat on the Mount of Olives, always teaching in a sitting position. That's a very Jewish context. Now, when they ask these three questions, keep in mind where they're coming from at this stage. At this stage, they do not yet understand the program of death and resurrection, do not yet understand the program of two comings. So they're raising these three questions based upon what they now understand. He will answer the questions in a way that will be fulfilled. But you have to understand where they're coming from. And so these three questions are at the same time three requests for signs. Number one, when shall these things be? What shall be the sign that these things are about to come to pass? This is Matthew's account. And notice the way they put it, what shall be the sign of the end of the world? More correct, the end of the age. Now Luke is the one that provides us sort of more details about the first question. Luke verse 7, when therefore shall these things be, and these things refers to the antecedent of these things is a prophecy about the coming destruction of the city and the temple. What shall be the sign when these things are about to come to pass? So coming from their perspective, there is two ages. This age, the age to come. This age is the age in which we now live. The age to come will be the Messianic age, the Messianic kingdom. So what is the sign that this age in which we now live will come to an end? Which in their mind will be with the destruction of the city and the temple. So what's the sign that these things are about to come to pass? Now the second question is, what shall be the sign of your coming? not the sign of your second coming. They don't understand this yet. What shall be the sign of your coming to bring about the establishment of the kingdom? He'll answer it in the context of the second coming, but where the question is coming from, they don't know this yet. So what's the sign of your coming? And the third question is, what is the sign that the end of the age has begun? What is the sign that the end of this age has become? Again, the thinking of two ages. This age, the age in which they were now living, the next age would be the Messianic age. They understand no interval period like the present church age. Now, he will answer all three questions, but he will not answer them in the order that they were asked. The first question he will answer is question number 3. What shall be the sign that the end of the age has begun? Then the second question he will answer is the first one. What is the sign that the city and the temple will be destroyed? And the third question he will answer is going to be number 2. What shall be the sign of your coming? So the order is 3, 1, 2. 3, 1, 2 is the order by which he will answer them. Furthermore, not every gospel writers provide all three answers. In fact, Matthew and Mark do not answer the first question. That's answered by Luke. And what they'll focus on will be the second and third question. So again, just keep remembering, their questions come for what they do not yet understand. He will answer the questions from the perspective of how it's going to be fulfilled. So he answers the third question first in 2 ways. First of all, negatively, meaning certain things will not be a sign that the last days of this age has begun. And the first thing is the rise of pseudo-messiahs. Now, in Jewish history, the first one to actually claim to be the Messiah was Yeshua, but a century later begins a long line of Jewish false messiahs. And the first one was Simon bar Kokhba, or Simon bar Kokhba, who led the second Jewish revolt against, he led the second Jewish revolt against Rome. After him, you have a whole line of false messiahs in Jewish history, some more dominant and prominent than others. The most widespread false messiah in the 1600s was a man named Shabtai Tzvi. He had a large following of Jews, both East and West. And he said he would ride into Istanbul and tell the Shah of the Turks to vacate the land of Israel and establish the Messianic kingdom. Well, when he got to the city, he was arrested by the Turks, and the Sultan gave him a choice. You can have a choice to renounce your claim to be the Jewish Messiah, and you can live, or you can claim to be the Jewish Messiah, and you will die. Well, this Messiah chose the lesser of the two dangers, and he converted to Islam. And he still had a small following, that this was a subterfuge, but the mass following he had sadly dissipated. And the last of the Jewish false messiahs has been a man from Poland named Jacob Frank in the late 1700s, early 1800s. Even among the Gentiles also, there have been false messiahs here and there. The most prominent in recent history was a man named Reverend Moon from South Korea. And he claimed to be the second coming of the Messiah. He had a large following both in the East and the West. But like other false messiahs, Reverend Moon underwent his own lunar eclipse and disappeared from the scene. Another thing that will be characteristics of the whole church age, wars and local wars. And so you'll hear about local wars here and local wars there. But concerning the rise of false messiahs, the local wars, notice what Matthew says at the end of verse 6. For these things must need come to pass, but the end is not yet. And people often assume if there's a war in the Middle East, it must be perfectly significant. Not necessarily. So when the first Gulf War broke out with the previous President Bush, a number of books came out here in the USA trying to prove that this was a fulfillment of prophecy, but the fact is there was no prophecy whatsoever of a war between the USA and Iran. When the second war broke out, the second Gulf War broke out, pardon? Iraq, sorry. Iraq. I wish it was Iran, but it's Iraq. When the second war broke out, Gulf War, with the second President Bush, there was a couple of books that came out, but people learned not to write those books anymore. And when the President Bush was first elected, there was a lot of fear and trepidation in Israel, because the last time the Jews listened to someone by the name of Bush, they got lost in the desert for 40 years. Some of you are a bit slow on that one. But the second President Bush was much more friendlier with Israel than the first Bush was. So the rise of false messiahs, local wars, doesn't mean the end of the age has begun. These will characterize the whole church age, but the end is not yet. He then gives the positive answer in the fourth division, the sign of the end of the age. And in Matthew verse 7:4, nation shall rise up against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There shall be famines and earthquakes in divers places, but all these things is the beginning of travail. The word travail means birth pang. It deals with a series of birth pangs a woman undergoes before she gives birth to a baby. By the same token, the end of this age will have a series of birth pangs before the birth of the new age, the Messianic age. But he's not dealing with birth pangs in general. Notice he specifies this is the beginning of travail. This is the first birth pang. And so the first birth pang is nation against nation and kingdom against kingdom. And that is somehow different than wars and rumors of wars, because wars and rumors of wars did not mean the end of the age has begun. When you see nation against nation, kingdom against kingdom, that is the sign the last days have begun. So what exactly was the difference? Now, the phrase nation against nation, kingdom against kingdom was a Jewish idiom in first century Jewish eschatology of a world war. So when you see a world war in contrast to local wars, that's the sign that the end of the age has begun. Now, how did they arrive at this? Let's turn to Isaiah chapter 19. Isaiah chapter 19. The idiom was already used in the Hebrew Bible for total warfare in the area of the context. Total warfare in the area of the context. And the context of chapter 19 of Isaiah is the context of Egypt. So verse 1, the burden of Egypt. Behold, Jehovah rides upon a swift cloud and comes down to Egypt. And the idols of Egypt shall tremble at his presence, and the heart of Egypt shall melt in the midst of it. I will stir up the Egyptian against the Egyptians, and they shall fight everyone against his brother, everyone against his neighbor, city against city, and kingdom against kingdom. There's your idiom. So the idiom is used in this context for total conflict, total civil war in the land of Egypt. affecting its economy, status, and everything. So in this context, applying to Egypt, total economic, military, civil war chaos in Egypt. Let's now turn to 2 Chronicles, chapter 15. 2 Chronicles, chapter 15. Here the context will be the area of the Middle East. Second Chronicles chapter 15, verse 3, 2 Chronicles, verse 3. But now for a long season, Israel was without the true God, and without a teaching priest, and without law. And when in their distress they turned unto Jehovah, the God of Israel, and sought him, he was found of them. And in those days there was no peace to him that went out, nor to him that came in. But great vexations were upon all the inhabitants of the lands, plural. And they were broken in pieces, nation against nation, and city against city, for God did vex them with all adversity. So you see the idiom used, but this time of the nations of the Middle East, describing chaos and conflict among the different nations of the Middle East. So from that usage, the rabbis in their eschatology, they've used this phrase, but they used it in a description of a world war. When you see a world war, in contrast to local wars, that's the sign the last days have begun. Now back to your harmony under point 4. What was mentioned several times is the world concept. So in Matthew's account, chapter 24, the term is used in verses 14, 21, 30, 31, 35, I repeat, verses 14, 21, 30, 31, 35. In Mark's account, verses 27 and 31, 27 and 31. In Luke's account, it's found in verses 26, 33, and 35. Luke's account, 26, 33, and 35. So again, when you see a world war in contrast to local wars, that's the sign that the last days have begun. Let me quote you some rabbinic ancient writings that uses these terms for that purpose. First quote, "At that time, war shall be stirred up in the world. Nation shall be against nation, city against city. Much distress shall be renewed against the enemies of Israel." A second quote, "When you shall see kingdoms rising at each other in turn, kingdom against kingdom, give heed and note the footsteps of the Messiah." And notice the phrase, the footsteps of the Messiah. This was a rabbinic term about the series of events that will finally lead to the coming of the Messiah and the establishment of the Messianic kingdom. So when I wrote my prophecy book, this is where I got the name of the book from, this rabbinic phrase, the footsteps of the Messiah, since I was dealing with the chronological sequence of prophetic events. Now, prophecy conference, invariably the question that is raised is these the last days? The answer is always yes, but then they give different reasons. Like the rise in power of communism, though that's not quite used as often as it used to be. Israel becoming a state, and other issues. Often how well the events affect the USA is if the USA is the market, is the criteria. Where we are in prophecy is how well the events affect Jewish history, not American history. And Washington, D.C. is not the holy city. Sorry about that. Now he points out this nation against nation, kingdom against kingdom will be coupled by famines and earthquakes. Now as far as famines in connection with the events following World War I in 1920, the Great Chinese Famine, followed in 1921 with the Great Russian Famine, and millions died. Now, as far as earthquakes, just before and after the First World War, 1905 India, 20,000 killed. 1908 Italy, 35,000 killed. 1915 Italy, 30,000 killed. 1920 China, 180,000 killed. 1923 Japan, 140,000 killed. And then a number subsequent since then. Now, I would agree that we're now living in the last days, but I would begin with the First World War. And in the First World War, every nation that existed at that point of time was involved either directly or indirectly, directly with the military or indirectly by supplying arms. And for all practical purposes, the Second World War was a continuation of the First World War, and both wars had a decisive impact on Jewish history. It was the results of the First World War that gave the impetus to the massive growth of Zionism. And the events of Second World War and the Holocaust gave the world stage the acceptance and recognition of Israel as a Jewish state. Even Russia voted for Israel to be recognized. They haven't voted for Israel much often since then, but they did recognize Israel. And so that's how we know where we're living the last days. But now, personal experiences of the apostles, normally he provides a chronological sequence, but when he breaks that chronological sequence, he will indicate it in some way. And so under section 5, look at Luke's account, verse 12. But before all these things, it'll be twice indicated that he's breaking the chronology. It's the first indication. But before all these things, meaning before what? Before that the sign of the last days ever happens, there'll be some other things that will happen which will involve the experiences by the apostles. So given here in Mark and Luke, what they will experience is, number one, they'll be rejected by the Jewish community. Secondly, they'll be rejected by the Gentile community. Thirdly, they'll suffer persecution, but the persecution will provide opportunities for a testimony. Fourthly, they'll succeed in proclaiming the gospel everywhere. Fifthly, they'll be given divine utterance when brought before judgment. So don't need to prepare a legal brief when they're going to be brought before a court of law. They'll be given divine utterance, so that when they speak, they'll be speaking the words the Holy Spirit gives them, and the enemy will not be able to dispel what they're declaring. He's already made it clear they'll be rejected by the Jewish community and Gentile community, but now it makes it more personal. They'll be rejected by members of their own family. That makes it a lot more personal. Seventh, they'll be hated by all. And so 10 of these 11 disciples are going to end up being martyred for the faith. Nevertheless, while their physical security is guaranteed, their physical security is not guaranteed, but their spiritual security is guaranteed. Now, verse 18 of Luke, not a hair of your head shall perish. People pull this out of context often. Several believing mothers during the Vietnam War would pull this out when the sons were sent to Vietnam, claiming that God promises they'll come back alive. Most did, but some did not. But just 2 verses earlier, notice, in verse 16, some of you shall be caused to be put of death. So in this very context, within 2 verses, you have, if he's guaranteeing physical security, you have a clear contradiction. He doesn't guarantee the physical security, and believers have been martyred throughout the ages. So that's not guaranteed. But their salvation is guaranteed. And ninth, they will succeed in winning souls everywhere. They'll succeed in winning souls everywhere. Okay, we'll take one more segment. Now in Luke's account, because he's the only one that answers the first question, he provides the sign of Jerusalem's fall. So what will be the sign Jerusalem is about to be destroyed? Verse 20, when you see Jerusalem compassed with armies, then know that desolation is at hand. When you see Jerusalem surrounded, then know that is the fulfillment of the previous prophecy about Jerusalem being destroyed. So if they are in the city, they need to get out. If they're outside the city, they must not go in. In other words, the Jewish believers are prohibited from taking up weapons to defend the city. They are to abandon it and let it be destroyed, which is the direct judgment of failing to recognize the Messiah. Now, the way this was fulfilled is that the revolt began in AD 66, and the then Roman governor Cestus Gallus, Gallus, assumed there was a local revolt. He brought his legions up to Jerusalem and besieged the city. But unknown to him, this was a nationwide revolt, and much to his astonishment, Jewish forces were cutting his supply line. He was forced to lift the siege and go back to Caesarea. The next 2 years, 66 to 68 AD, Jerusalem was no longer under siege. Now, when the siege first began, the Jewish believers took that to be the sign Yeshua promised to give them. And they knew they had to simply abandon the city. Because the Romans were sitting outside, they could not do so, but when they lifted the siege, in that period of time, the entire Messianic community of Jerusalem, that numbered at least 20,000 strong, they were joined by Messianic Jews from Judea and from Galilee, and even from the Golan, and they crossed the Jordan River to a city called Pella, P-E-L-L-A. P-E-L-L-A. And they waited the war out in the city of Pella. And the war ended 4 years later in AD 70. According to Josephus' reckoning, somewhere between about 1,100,000 Jews were killed. 1,100,000 Jews were killed. But not a single believing Jew lost his life because of obedience to the admonition, when you see Jerusalem surrounded, get out of town. There's a few more comments I want to make about section 6, but my time is up, so we'll pick it up with this section tonight.